Alright everybody, I'm going to start the material on peer review, publishing, and replication. Some other things we'll talk about on our journey here as well. So at this point, you hopefully have already taken a look at the other things that I posted for Monday, April 20th. Those things were and I guess maybe you have done them on Friday because I didn't have the audio working for the correct video. But anyway, those kind of introductory materials that I posted for the replication crisis were the John Oliver video, the chapter that Ed Diener and another author wrote, and a couple of those YouTube videos with Samin Vazir and Daniel Simons. So hopefully those have given you kind of a good introduction to some of the things that we'll be talking about today. Usually I try to show that John Oliver video earlier in the semester in the first couple lectures, but we just didn't quite have time for it this semester, so I'm glad I got to get it in there. I know some of the content is not like exactly on task the whole time. The sexual habits of the bears that he's imagining, not exactly fitting totally into our class mission, but he does make some really good points and cover some, even psychologists like Brian Nosek, somebody who we'll mention later in this lecture, has kind of a quick interview there at the beginning. So to start this off though, I'm going to spend this first video talking about some parts of the peer review and publication process. As you know, now where all of you are in the class, you're kind of finishing up your papers, you're getting close to the editing stage, you're doing your own peer reviews for other people in class that are, if you're watching this video when it is released, those are due tonight as a reminder on April 22nd. So you're kind of at a stage where some of the things, if you were doing, this as I don't want to say a real researcher, but somebody who's actually, doing this as part of grad school or career or something, you're thinking about some of the same things they would be thinking about at this stage. So, one thing that comes up relatively frequently in the life of a researcher is that you get done with a particular study and you kind of have a lot of these points where you're trying to think about and make decisions about what you're going to do with it. So once you've completed a study, you might be kind of at a loss for a little bit, especially if you're earlier in your career. Do I need to do more? Do I need to try to publish this? How does it work? And usually you want to try to get your work published, obviously, to get accomplishments and get notoriety and show that you're, getting your research done, all that good stuff. So trying to get a study published is, an ongoing activity or sometimes struggle for many researchers. But how do you actually go about getting published? What are the steps involved? How does that process actually work? Because, I don't know, it kind of sounds like it may be straightforward that you send something into a journal, they decide if it's good enough, and they put it in writing, or in print rather. And some of that, describes the process, but there is a lot more to it. If you were a researcher working in the, early part of the last century, or even the 60s or the 70s, to some extent, if you'd completed a single study, you would really be kind of on your way. There were just so many fewer people doing research that if you had a well-run study that had some interesting results, you would publish that, maybe even on its own. So you would write up your results just in the way that all of you have for this class, and you would submit that to a journal. So they'd be relatively short papers, most of the time looking at a relatively simple manipulation too, honestly. But anymore, that's just not the case. Partly because, with, kind of in the same way that like applying to college or applying to grad school or applying for a job, people's credentials are kind of deflated now. That people are always one-upping each other. People always have more extracurriculars or a higher GPA or more research experience or another internship or whatever. Just how you need way more credentials to get the same type of job or get into the same type of school you would have 10 years ago. To get published in the same journals, you need a lot more and better evidence to get published in those same journals, because there are more people doing better research all the time. So, single study papers, it's relatively infrequent for most areas of psychology that those are going to get published. So this kind of begs the question, what do you include in a paper? Do you have to run 100 studies to get a paper published? Well, no, that's probably overkill, right? In fact, you wouldn't have room because most of these journals have word limits and space constraints. So how many studies do take up a paper? There are some types of articles, generally called short reports, that do actually comprise one paper, or one study, sorry. So those are generally considered maybe a little bit less prestigious, but they also might be like very new research that people haven't had the time yet to package up with other studies into a big coherent narrative. So sometimes there do tend to be papers of certain types with a single study in them. More long research articles tend to be maybe up to 10 studies, honestly. I'd say the modal number, the most common number, is probably around 3 to 4. That 3 to 4 well-run studies that connect together in some narrative way. But in the really prestigious journals, it isn't uncommon to see 8 to 10 studies if you are running the types of studies that we've talked about a lot in this class, where there are surveys on the internet or in a laboratory or doing a quick manipulation. People want to see a lot of evidence and a lot of converging evidence, and they want to see these studies building on one another. And to do that, you need multiple studies. So some of the more prestigious journals in some areas, you need this big story that you're constructing from multiple studies, basically. Just to kind of compare this to some other things we've talked about a bit too, a meta-analysis is a little bit of a different animal. A meta-analysis, as hopefully you have some sense at this point, is trying to estimate the size of a given effect that we observe in research. It is trying to, rather than capitalize on chance like single papers and single studies tend to do, is trying to really have a clear estimate of how two variables are related. So we'll kind of circle back to the importance of meta-analyses in a little bit. But in this list, when we're talking about how many studies comprise a paper, you can kind of think of a meta-analysis in a couple of different ways. You might think of a meta-analysis as a single study that is studying studies, thus the meta part of meta-analysis. Or some meta-analyses, if you think about how many individual studies they are compiling from other researchers, sometimes it is in the range of, 700 studies or even 1,000 studies sometimes. Some that are covering newer areas of research, maybe they only have 30 studies in them. But keep in mind, the researchers that are doing meta-analyses are not conducting all of these studies. They are compiling data from other researchers, taking their effect sizes and sample sizes and things about their variance, and then trying to estimate one big effect size for what the quote-unquote true effect actually is. So for some areas, this is going to be a really big number of studies. For newer research areas, it'll be smaller. And this thing that I have here, actually, depending on your research area and research question that I have down here, this affects these numbers too. If you are submitting a study to a journal, and it's like a longitudinal study where you've tracked the same people for 30 years, and you are looking at a question that can only be answered longitudinally, and it's very time-consuming and expensive. No one expects you to have 10 of those studies, right? You might have a lot of research questions that you can answer in that single study. So in some areas like developmental psychology, clinical psychology, the norms are a little bit different. My experience, just to remind you, is more in the social and political psychology areas. So this is, in some senses speaking a little bit more to that, but also it just varies. Even in social psychology, if you did a big study with, bringing two groups on different sides of an ethnic conflict together to try to reduce prejudice, like that would be a big undertaking where you would probably really only need one study to get a good publication out of that. But all this stuff, it does depend on your research area. It does depend on the journal and their different norms. I'm just trying to give you, kind of a quick idea of what things are like out there on the mean streets of publishing. I started thinking about that, using that phrase just now, the mean streets, and I thought, that's going to sound stupid when you say it, and then I said it anyway. So, there you go. I say dumb things even when I'm recording, not just in front of you. Anyway. One constant that you should keep in mind as you're, thinking about how this works and the pressures that might come from, having to include 8 or 10 studies in a paper, that you can't really double dip. You can't use the same findings in a different paper. So if you've tested the relationship between, let's say, our old friend stress and test performance, if you have a data set and you've tested the relationship between stress and test performance and you submit that to a journal and you get it published, you can't reuse that study in another paper. But let's say you measured some other things in that study. You measured also how people felt about their test performance and if it had anything to do with their eating habits or something. Like if you had other things that you measured and other research questions, then you can, ethically use those other analyses in a different paper. That opens a whole nother can of worms, though, because you need to be upfront when you run a study about all the different things you're measuring and all the different things involved in a given study. So we'll get back to that again in a little bit when we talk more about things about honesty and ethical publishing practices and things like that. Questionable research practices. But just note for the time being that, when you're doing 10 studies, those are 10 different studies, and you should not be using those same findings in different papers. Getting published, you also have to choose what outlet, what journal you're going to submit to, and this is often kind of a long conversation that collaborators have and get advice from other people about to try to pick somewhere that is going to be the right level of notoriety but also is realistic. Things that you might be thinking about hopefully are the people that are interested in your work going to end up reading it? Like, is it worthwhile for you to submit a paper about racial attitudes and eyewitness identification to a personality journal? Well, probably not. Like, the people that care about that aren't going to read it, and you probably won't get accepted anyway. Does it make sense to submit it to a real general journal like psychological science that lots of different types of researchers read? Well, maybe it's useful to submit to Psych Science because it has a wide readership, but there are probably a lot of people that read that journal that don't really care about that research question. Maybe if you're interested in having people that really know about that read it, you would instead submit to something like Law and Human Behavior, where it's a lot of people that do things related to legal procedures and eyewitness memory and stuff like that. Not that either one of those answers is wrong. Like Psych Science is a great journal that a lot of people would read, and a lot of people want to have that on their CV, their resume. But sometimes you might want to aim for a more focused or subfield journal to get a different group of people reading it. This who reads the journal kind of goes hand in hand with what organizations is the journal affiliated with. Most journals have kind of like a sponsoring organization, or some organizations even sponsor multiple journals. So the International Society for Political Psychology, for example, publishes a journal called, appropriately enough, Political Psychology, and a yearly volume called Advances in Political Psychology. So submitting to those journals, if that's a conference that you go to, those are people that you belong to that society, then it makes some sense to submit your work to that journal. But if you also work in that field, you might know that political psychology, at least the last editorial team that ended their term about a year ago, had like an enormous backlog of submissions, such that they were just rejecting all kinds of papers because they had too many submissions in a queue ready to be looked at. So that was, for a little while, kind of a place where papers went to die. Even if they were good, they would end up sitting in an online queue for a while and then just get rejected. So there's all these kinds of back room things you need to be aware of too when you're trying to publish stuff. But either way, thinking about the organizations that you're a part of and who's going to read them matters a lot. This used to be maybe even more of an impactful question because in being a member of these societies, you would get copies of these journals, and you still get online access to them. But with people having more widespread access to all sorts of different kinds of papers from any journal, basically, it's less common that people are going to be worried about, like, well, are people actually going to be getting this journal? Because very few people really get physical journals anymore. One way you can measure whether a journal is a good place to submit to in a very competitive sort of sense is something called an impact factor. There are lots of different ways you can measure impact or prestige of a journal. I have one set of measures here. These are the rankings of journals in the area of social psychology. So on the vertical list here, we have titles of different journals, and on the top we have different ways that you might rank them. Like H-index is a way to measure like citations by the number of articles. It's kind of a complicated metric in a way that's more complicated than this description here even says, but it's an index that you can use for journals or researchers. But this is one reasonable way you might rank journals. Or maybe you want to look at something else, like total citations that they have over the last 3-year period. If you sort them that way, then you see something a little bit different. You see JPSP, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Most people in social psych would say this is kind of the flagship journal, but if you go by this particular metric, then it goes down a little bit, and you have a lot of these kind of more medical focused journals having a little bit more prestige here. Maybe that's just a function of people outside of psychology citing these journals more often, or that you have people in psych and outside of psych citing them. Who knows? Or total sites, it might just be that these journals have more articles in them. So maybe you want to do citations per document rather than just total number of citations. Then you see something a little different, that JPSP is down a little bit further. you have nature and human behavior, annual review, social issues, and personality and social psych review, getting more citations per document. So, I mean, these are all, I don't want to say subjective, but they're all focusing on slightly different things. But when people go up for like tenure review, when you're entering your 6th year of having a faculty job, frequently your tenure committee, depending on the institution you're at, is going to look at these type of rankings and say, well, they published in 4 of the top 10 journals in their field's H index, and that supposedly says something about your success as a researcher. So something else to think about. But ideally you're thinking of a mixture of these different things. I don't have this one written here, but truthfully, the real answer to what outlet to use is what is the most prestigious one that you can get it in, which is, I know, a cynical way to look at it, but it's also very true. Authors often are submitting papers to journals much in the same way that you apply to a few reach schools and then more schools that you think that you actually could get into, right? So you're applying to really prestigious journals or submitting manuscripts to those journals, and if they get rejected, well, then you go down the line and you submit to one that's maybe a little bit more realistic. Excuse me. So a lot of papers have actually been submitted to more than one journal before they get published, but you can't submit to more than one journal at a time. You submit to the first journal, you wait for the review period, which depending on the editors could take 3, 6, 9 months if they're really bad, and then if they end up rejecting it, then you ideally would pick the next place, or you think it could be published, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Figuring out the requirements of formatting. I know we've talked a lot about APA this semester, and that tends to be a very useful thing to know when applying to journals, but journals also, unfortunately, all have their own dumb stuff that they decide that people need to do. They all have different word counts, and they all count the words in different ways. So you might have your paper all done, but then you need to make sure that it's under 9,000 words, and you have to check, does that include references? Does it include tables? Does it include footnotes? Does it include the notes below your figures? Basically, every different journal has a different rule for this that is supposedly based on something meaningful about how much space they have, but also everything's online now, so who cares? We should just stop printing these anyway. So you need to pay attention to all of these things when you're submitting, and lots of different journals also happen to use different online systems. Some use the same ones, but there's not a ton of overlap, so you're frequently having to relearn or learn from scratch a whole new system every time you submit somewhere, which is a whole lot of fun and not at all a waste of time. I'm getting more cynical than I wanted to this early in the presentation, but anyway. Yeah, word counts are, like I've already mentioned, can be very frustrating because, the difference between 9,000 and 9,500 words maybe doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but man, can it really ruin a week when you're trying to cut those things down and not lose the real important parts of your paper. Yes. So I'm going to stop this video here just because I want to make sure I'm breaking these up and not going too long, and I will get on the next one to start, already losing the ability to speak. So looking forward to talking about the peer review process in just a moment.